And they would hold those plays in their head. There may be 7 or 8 of those brand new, and a brand new play would take, from the moment of delivery to performance, 3 weeks to perfect. But during the 3 weeks, they'd be doing other plays from their repertoire, and therefore they'd have to have enormous memories. I mean, Burbage would play Richard III at the drop of a hat, come back on as Henry V next day. No modern actor could do that for more than, say, 3 or 4 plays. At Stratford at the moment, they rarely do more than 3 plays in a season. Alan Howard, one of our leading actors some years ago, I remember going to see him, he did 3 of the major parts of Shakespeare in the course of a week, but he had the odd day off, and of course he could go home and look at the text and work on it. Whereas these chaps would arrive on tour somewhere, and maybe in Oxford, say, and the mayor of Oxford would say, Mr. Burbage, I enjoyed your Henry V, could we have that? And literally, at the drop of a hat, he could do it. And that's 2nd or 3rd longest part in Shakespeare.
So what happened was that they could dictate their parts, so to speak, to
Absolutely.
someone, and then someone could try to put it together
Exactly.
to make
or
a play?
Somebody who'd been in the play, who'd fallen out with the company, could get together with 3 or 4 others, and between them they could remember enough of the play for a version to be there. So the bad quarto of Hamlet, which you heard, I'm fairly certain was constructed in that way by actors, and that was a pirated edition. The first real edition of Hamlet, of course, was the first folio in 1623.
You decided to switch names to write this historical series, and you call yourself Edward Marston. What's the genesis of the pseudonym?
Well, the genesis of the switch was the gentleman who was my editor for the golf books moved publishing houses and said, why did you bring the golf books over there? And I said, well, hang on, why don't I leave the golf books here and do something else for you under a different name? So he said, fine. And then a very good Elizabethan name is Marston, because John Marston was an Elizabethan playwright who had a long feud with Ben Jonson, but more particularly with Shakespeare. John Marston was a very prickly character. His plays are never performed these days, with the exception of perhaps one, The Malcontent. And when I say prickly, Shakespeare's most revolting character, I think, Thersites in Troilus and Cressida, was based on John Marston. We had what was called the War of the Theatres, which was a war between the professional theatres, the places like the Globe and so on, and the Rose Theatre, which were adult performers, and the children's theatres. There were 2 of those, but the worst one was in Blackfriars, the Children of the Chapel Royal, which I deal with in one of my books, of course, the Laughing Hangman. The problem there was that boys of 12, 13 and 14 were performing plays written by the best playwrights of the day, like Ben Jonson and like John Marston. And they used those plays to attack the plays performed in the other theatres, and Shakespeare used his plays to attack them. Of course, the famous one being in Hamlet, when he talks about the little Aeses, the little people who force out other birds from the nest, as it were. In other words, they were ruining the audience at the Globe, because the Globe was open to the elements. It could only perform certain times of the year, and only in daylight. Whereas in Blackfriars, it was indoor, and with lighting they could perform every day of the year, and had no problems with weather, of course. So they were a real threat to the employment of actors.
And actors had very tenuous employment. In fact, the troupe that Nicholas Bracewell, for whom he acts as the bookkeeper or the bookholder, you call them Lord Westfield's men.
Yes.
And Lord Westfield being a noble who sponsors, right? Was that normal for?
It was not. It was normal, and it was necessary, because in the 1570s a law was passed which said that all actors are outlaws unless they are sponsored, if you like, by a patron. And a patron obviously had to be a member of the aristocracy. So we had Leicester's men, and then we had Lord Chamberlain's men, which was the company that Shakespeare was in. And we had the Admiral's men, which is where Edward Allen was performing. Edward Allen, perhaps I would think, would be the greatest of all Elizabethan actors, certainly greater than Burbage. And his particular talent was for the work of Marlowe. And Marlowe wrote all of those wonderful parts, like Dr. Faustus and Tamburlaine, which is an enormously long play in 2 halves. It was said of Allen that Allen was spelled A-L-L-E-Y-N, by the way, that he knew 42 plays which he could do at the top drop of a hat, of the length of Dr. Faustus, who never gets off stage, of course, in the play of that name. And he made so much money out of acting, in fact, that he founded Dulwich College in London, where years later a gentleman called Raymond Chandler was a student. And as you know, Raymond Chandler's protagonist is called Philip Marlowe, and the connection there, of course, is with Edward Allen, who played all of Marlowe's characters. If you go to Dulwich College, you'll see a large portrait of Christopher Marlowe, and that's where the idea for Philip Marlowe came. So there's a link there between the Elizabethan theatre and the present-day crime writing. But the point you make is very important, that writers, actors particularly, had the most precarious living. To begin with, there were two halves. They were what were called the sharers, who literally bought their way into the joint stock company, which was the company.
Right.
And they were guaranteed employment in all the best parts. The smaller parts were played by what was called hired men, jobbing actors who were brought in maybe for 2 or 3 performances, paid 6 or 7 shillings a week, and then the moment they toured, they reduced the size of the company, so those guys were out, and only the sharers performed. But you had so many problems. The obvious one was the plague, and that came along time and time again. And the moment that the plague deaths got above a certain number, any public gathering was forbidden. So all the bear baiting arenas, all public meetings, all the theatres were closed, and all they could do was either go on tour, go to healthier places, possibly go abroad, which is what happens in my most recent novel. And going abroad was an expensive undertaking, because you had to go for a long period to make it worthwhile. Having said that, once they got there, they discovered that in Belgium, in Germany, in France, and more particularly in Italy and in Bohemia, they were far better off than they were over here. They were literally treated like gods, because the level of performance over there was nowhere near as high as it was over here. So they were professionals competing with amateurs. And even though many of the audience couldn't understand English, nevertheless they came to see these wonderful performers because they were so good. And the plays they brought were so good, because all of the Elizabethan companies had their own resident playwrights. Right. I mean, as we know, Admiral's men had Marlowe, and the Chamberlain's men had Shakespeare and other writers. Shakespeare, of course, was an actor as well, and was very clever enough to write little parts for himself. Now, I worked as an actor and a writer, and I always used to write little parts in for myself. Then I began to direct the plays, and so I kept out of the limelight, and occasionally I would always fall for the temptation of writing myself a small vignette that I could come in, which I always describe as short but telling, usually towards the end so people remembered you. The worst thing in a play is to do your number at the very beginning, like the prologue, and then by the end they've forgotten you.
Alfred Hitchcock did that in his films, didn't he?
Oh, he did.
There was always a moment
Absolutely.
in which you could see Hitchcock on the bus or on
Exactly.
the train or whatever.
He walked across.
Yeah, and you do, in fact, use one of these resident playwrights, is because the fun of the Nicholas Bracewell or Lord Westfield's Men Elizabethan series that you write is that we have Nicholas, who is sort of the pivot as the book holder. Then we have Lawrence Firestone, who is the larger-than-life, incredibly temperamental, heavily oversexed actor, principal actor, some other members of the company who are actors, and then you have this wonderful fellow who's the playwright. And he's always being, you know, he's kind of melancholy sometimes because he doesn't have enough inspiration, or he doesn't think his work is hip.
Absolutely.
So he's a bit like a manic depressive. He's either really up writing the play or really crashed because he can't think of one.
Yes, that's in the nature of theatre. It is a manic depressive profession. You know, when you're up, and all actors today particularly have this strange biological clock, which means that they perform between 7:30 and 10:30, and then they come alive. And actors only really live once they come off with the adrenaline flowing. No actor goes to bed at 10:45. I mean, he's up till 2, 3 in the morning. Then he will sleep maybe till lunchtime and then kind of build himself up for the evening performance. And these guys had to do this every day. They performed 7 days a week. Between the hours of 2:30 and 4:35. The plays then were much shorter, of course, because what Shakespeare and the others were writing was these plays with this wonderful skin of words. They didn't have the production facilities we had. They didn't have lighting and all that sort of thing. So the play at Stratford, which takes 4 hours, would be reduced by at least 25% in performance of the day. And it was the use of words. The words did all the work that, you know, now our modern effects can do. It was an extraordinary, it must have been an extraordinary experience, and we can, to some extent, relive it by visiting the Globe Theatre in London, which has been rebuilt, as you know. Now that, at the present time, holds 1,500. In Shakespeare's day, it held 3,000. And the atmosphere was much more akin to a Super Bowl, much more kind of liveliness amongst the audience, and the function of the actor was to keep the audience under control and play them in the same way as a vaudeville comedian would play them. That's why they had to have wonderful voices and that extraordinary kind of overblown style of acting, which today would be considered to be operatic, and a complete control of gesture, so people at the very back could know what was going on if they couldn't hear the words.
And most of the audience was in fact standing throughout the performance in something, what did they call it, the pit?